Welcome back, friends. I'm Frank Vagnone, President and CEO of Old Salem Museums and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And I'm joined by Daniel Ackerman, Chief Curator of the organization. This is part of our series of color and preservation. Today, we're talking about red. Daniel, I'm calling this the Red Room. Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, Frank, so this room was actually built for a house on the eastern shore of Maryland, about 1700, 1710. And when it was first built, as you can see, it was painted sort of red all over.
This red color seems kind of common. It almost feels utilitarian.
Yeah, so red colors like this one in the 17th and 18th century really were the true workhorse colors. They were, generally speaking, the least expensive colors, the easiest colors to make, because the materials generally that were being used, the pigments that were being used to make these colors, are not particularly rare or exotic.
Dirt, stone, or just normal stuff?
Absolutely. There are a number of different chemicals and pigments that can be used. This particular room was painted using red ochre, which is a particular kind of sort of red mineral that's not particularly uncommon, and red lead. And those two pigments together sort of give you this color, which often in historic documents we hear referred to as Spanish brown, but in reality can be anything from a deep, rich, reddish brown all the way to this sort of more vivid red color.
Is there some relationship of trade to red, or is red much more universally used throughout the world?
I think red is universally used throughout the world. I mean, anybody who's ever been outside after a rainstorm knows it's really easy to turn your white pants red. And so the minerals that are going to give you a red color are pretty common.
And if anyone knows the South, we've got really red dirt. And then that brings me to bricks, tile, and pottery. So talk a little bit about how not only is it an applied paint, but it's the very fabric of materiality in Southern buildings.
Clay, as a material, is heavily dependent on geology, which is heavily dependent on place. And different kinds of clay have different characteristics based on where they're deposited, but also how much processing goes on. So for example, if you want to pick that up and
You're going to let me pick this up?
You can pick that up,
okay,
and look at its bottom where it's unglazed. You'll see it's kind of a reddish color.
Yeah.
I mean, that is North Carolina redware. So that is a very iron-rich red clay body that's been turned and formed into that pitcher. And then to give you that red decoration, they've taken an even more sort of iron-rich, red-rich clay, watered it down to make slip, dipped it in that, and then what you get is that rich red sort of ground color. Bricks, similarly, they're being made from local clay, but they are less refined. There used to be this idea that bricks would be imported into a place, but the reality is most locations have the natural materials to make bricks, and bricks are heavy, and so you tend to make them close to whatever you're building, which means that the bricks you're using are very much of the place you're building.
When we see buildings made of brick during this time period, we're most likely looking at a material that was produced by enslaved labor.
I think it'd be hard to find an example of a brick building in the South that did not at some stage of its construction involve enslaved labor, all the way from the mining of the clay to the making of the brick to actually putting the bricks into form and building the house.
When we talk about textile reds, we shift into a new way of producing that pigment.
Absolutely. So, it's one thing to find the pigments to bind with oil and put on a wall. Textiles, dyes, are a totally different kind of thing. So, if we look at this chair, this is a reproduction cushion, or poof, as they might have called it in the time. That sort of gives you an idea of what a naturally dyed red fabric might have looked like in the 18th or late 17th century. This is made probably using a vegetable dye, but there's also the ability to make red dyes using insects.
Bugs?
Bugs, crushed up bugs.
Tell me about that. When did they start using bugs for red?
So certainly by the Middle Ages, they're using bugs for red, but it's really the beginning of colonization in the Americas. where you start seeing cochineal, which is a traditional indigenous recipe for red. Generally, those bugs tend to be in Central and South America. That indigenous knowledge is being brought back by the Spanish and Portuguese to Europe and creating these really, really vivid red dye colors. One of the challenges with any kind of color story is that you not only want the color to be really crisp and clear when it's originally made, but you want it to stay that way. And that's a function both of the dye you're using as well as the material you're using it with. And reds, really vivid reds, as I think anybody who has red fabric in their house knows, they tend to be what we might call very fugitive, particularly when exposed to light over long periods of time. And so it's not uncommon when we look at period materials dyed with various types of red dye that they faded to a sort of mottled pink. So this needlework picture was worked in Virginia in the 1770s by a young girl named Elizabeth Bush. And over the 200 and some years since she finished her picture, a lot of the reds have gone much less vivid.
It's a good example for us to use when we talk about paint and preservation, that what we traditionally view as comfortable, appropriate historic colors are really possibly not accurate at all. They're just things that we socially have gotten used to. When we look at this would have most likely been a really vibrant piece of artwork.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things we miss when we start reproducing colors of the past, is we tend to think of the past as being much less colorful than it really was.
And now that leads me to this thing, which is just this incredible, like if you asked me to give you a series of hues of red, this image is it. I mean, this is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so this is an edition of Mark Catesby's Natural History. Catesby was an English naturalist who spent time in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the Caribbean in the 1720s and 1730s. And when he goes back to England, he creates a 2-volume work. They're employing artisans, usually women artisans, whose job is to hand watercolor with a set of instructions. One of the reasons why color nomenclature starts to get standardized are actually things like this. It's natural histories, it's science, it's geology. It's the need to be able to say, this bird is this color.
Which is a form of taxonomy.
Absolutely.
Which is coming from the Enlightenment. It's coming from notions of trying to organize the natural world. I would imagine that getting the color correct is just as important as, for instance, in this case, the form of the beak.
Exactly.
This has been a fascinating discussion, Daniel. Thank you so much. I won't be able to walk along historic district like Salem or any other part of the world without really noticing red. I mean, red will be in the soil and the bricks and the roof tiles. It's really a part of our human experience. It just is very fundamental. And you get that sense when you're sitting in this room. It just is a basic kind of quality of our existence. Thank you for joining us with this episode of Color and Preservation. We look forward to seeing you with another episode. I'm Frank Vagnone.
I'm Daniel Ackerman.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.